Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
And Junius, you've had a big couple months here, buying a house, moving. You feeling all settled?
Yeah, there's still a lot of boxes to go through. And the garage is still a bit of a staging area, but we did a house blessing a week ago, and that forced us to have to get the house presentable. And that's a nice space to be working from. Now we feel like we really live here, and we're just trying to figure out what to do with the rest of the stuff that we probably don't really need anyway.
Excellent. And of course, the astute, viewers of the video will recognize that you're in a different location. This is your new office.
This is my new office, and it's a wonderful place to work.
That is awesome. That's the most important thing I think about moving, is making sure that the office situation is squared away.
Yeah, especially if you work from home like I do. And so I'm spending a lot of time in this room, so I need to have a good feel for it. It needs to be productive for thinking and all that sort of thing. And I think it definitely has that.
Absolutely. Well, good. Well, I'm glad you're all settled and that we can kind of resume our regularly scheduled programming. We'll have some exciting announcements in the coming months about what we're doing come fall and all that with our agenda and our schedule. But we'll delay that for a little while, make the listeners wait on the edge of their seats for that kind of stuff. But today we are looking at key essays of the Federalist Papers. We thought it might be a little much to do the whole work, and so we picked out a few of the essays that we thought would have some, insights into the heart of the work as a whole, and some that have really some palpable application points to where we are currently. And I think one other kind of prefatory comment to make is that the canon is a pretty vast thing when we talk about the great works. But given our situatedness in the United States, it's really important that we pay special attention to this part of the canon. And so I remember, I think the first time we ever did Frederick Douglass, one of our international listeners wrote in and basically was like, why would you talk about this? What can I learn about from this? But we're American, and so we got to pay special attention to this. And even if you're not American, there's still plenty that can be learned, both good and bad, from American literature. But I'm excited to jump into this with you.
Yeah, I think so too. And this is, it's so important because one of the key discussions about American politics and government and whatnot is the question of foundationalism. To what extent should the intentions of the founding fathers guide what we do today, and to what extent should it not? And our goal here is not to push any particular understanding of that, but it's if we were to say something about that, I think we would say that it should be a conversation. And in a conversation, you've really got to listen to the other person, but you've also really got to speak. And the world that we live in is not like the world that the founding fathers lived in. And so it's at least worthwhile to reevaluate whether that changes some of the thoughts they had or presents new opportunities, new obstacles, or whatever else. And so this is really very much at the heart of a classical way of thinking, to go back to these documents that are still governing how we are living today, and to reconsider them and take up that conversation with them and see what new things they have to teach us that maybe we hadn't seen before or that we've forgotten, as well as to see ways in which we might have some new questions that it will be interesting to put to these guys.
I think, too, that kind of touches on my experience with this text previously, which is that I think I picked this up in high school for a class on American history that we had to read selections from it. And I think when we talk about the founding fathers and foundationalism and all that, it's a complicated question because, well, I'll give you an analogy. Growing up in a more Protestant environment, people would often say, well, the Bible says, and then they would insert their opinion about whatever topic it was. And once you kind of investigated that a little bit more thoroughly, you'd realize, well, the Bible isn't necessarily saying as strongly what you might think it's saying. In other words, it was an interpretation question, but they would sort of say, well, the Bible says, as if they weren't doing the interpreting, they were just telling you what the Bible says. Right. I remember one church I grew up near had on the pulpit, sola scriptura in big white letters on the pulpit. So in other words, what the pastor's saying and what the scriptures say are identical. And I mean, in theory, that should be the case, but of course it's more complicated than that. And so once I think there were people when I was growing up and taking a class on American history and reading the founding fathers and all that, there were people who would do kind of the same thing with the founding fathers. Well, the founding fathers say, or the founding fathers believed, and then they'd insert their opinion there. And then you start doing the historical work and you actually read these essays, you read some of their other writings, and you realize, well, they're not a monolithic entity. The founding fathers disagree amongst themselves quite frequently. And even when they agree, I mean, there's still a lot of nuance that needs to be hashed out in terms of what did they really mean, what did they really believe, and all that stuff. And so, it's definitely important to engage them in that conversation, like you say, because I think it allows there to be a little bit more of that nuance that's needed, really, to, I think, appreciate the text and to dialogue with it.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And that's a good analogy to the sense, because in both senses, what we have is an appeal to tradition, and an appeal to the authority of an authoritative set of texts or an authoritative set of individuals or whatever else, and the belief that that the text is just so clear and univocal on the face of it that just by reading it, everyone would get the same meaning, and that meaning is the law. That's a bit naive. Very, very simple texts like the Chronicles of Narnia, people read and have different interpretations of what's going on. And so there's always the work of taking up that's got to happen.
That's right. That's right. I think it's about some of our conversations here on these great texts where we've come away with different interpretations, different readings. We've disagreed about some things in the text, and that's good. That's how the conversation continues forward. Without that, it would be a really dry exercise. There would be no real need for conversation. We would just kind of have data in and data out, and it would not really. It would be very not human, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I agree.
Now, I will say these texts feel especially relevant given where we are today. As I was reading them, I thought, man, if only they could be alive and see how things are going. These guys would definitely have some things to say to us. I mean, I think on the one hand, we have a rise of a kind of populism that sometimes has some illiberal tendencies in it. And so a lot of the kind of ideas undergirding the text would, I think, if we bring those to bear on some of that modern conversation, have a lot to say. And then we see, I think, legally some real debates going on in terms of of federalism and in terms of the role of the judiciary. For example, we're going to talk about each branch of government, and that certainly seems one where what is exactly the role of the judge in our legal system and all that. It's a lot. And so these are interesting texts to visit during this time.
Yeah, that's right. I was flying to DC when I was reading this to hang out with you at the Redefining the Classics conference. And so it was very interesting to be flying into our nation's capital while reading the Federalist Papers. And several times I thought to myself, can we just make all of the congressmen sit down and read these? And I thought, well, I mean, come on, these guys are political science majors and lawyers and constitutional law and things like that. Surely they've read these things. And I thought, yeah, they probably have, but I don't feel like I can see evidence that they have all the time in the ways that they behave and the things that they support and whatnot. And that's an interesting place to be, to feel like, I kind of just want to, have a seminar and sit all of Congress down and let's talk through these papers again in seminar format and figure out, what do we like and not like about this? And, what are we missing? Because there's a lot of stuff here that I thought was very prophetic about our current moment and prophetic in a way that made me feel like, well, there might be some resources here that could help us understand what we should be doing in our present moment better. I'm not saying it's going to solve our problems. I'm also not saying that I agree with everything that's in there, but it was interesting to see some of our contemporary problems that I feel like have gotten worse over my lifetime, diagnosed so clearly over 200 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we could talk a little bit at this point about the historical setting of the Federalist Papers, why they were written, and kind of the problems that were facing America when they were penned. Because these were not written during the Revolutionary War. These were written sort of after that had ended. And of course, immediately after the Revolutionary War, there was no constitution, at least not the way that we have it. We had the Articles of Confederation, which were enforced from about 1781 till 1789. And under them, there was a ton of financial and political instability because the articles really lacked a kind of central authority. So, for example, in the articles, there is no executive branch and there is no judiciary. So there was Congress, and that was pretty much it. But even Congress was rather impotent. They had no ability to tax. So they could request funds from the states, say, hey, we need to raise, $1 million to fund an army. And the states could either pay up or not. And in most of the cases, the states didn't. They would just ignore whatever the federal government asked. And so that meant that you had an underfunded federal government that wasn't able to pay its debts, which, of course, being birthed from a war, they had those. And you also had their inability to then kind of fund basic operations moving forward, like having an army. And so it also posed problems, that decentralized nature of the Articles of Confederation posed problems for interstate relations because there was no real central regulation of trade. So, for example, each state would have its own currency. So if you were to move from one state to another and you had your life savings in Massachusetts bucks and you wanted to go to, Vermont and get Vermont dollars, that you'd have to convert your currency, and who knows whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing for you. And you also had the ability for states to impose tariffs on other states. Tariffs is something we're talking a lot about now in the modern political landscape, and it's been kind of a crazy adjustment period as that's become more of a reality. But imagine if Texas was putting tariffs on goods imported from Florida, or that would just cause absolute chaos. And so that was really kind of where they found themselves. And there was a kind of existential security threat in that the British still had a presence in North America. And so you have a federal government that's not able to defend themselves during that time. So, and not only the British, I think the Spanish were also still occupying like parts of the Mississippi River, basically. So on both sides, both North and kind of West, you're being hemmed in by other countries, and you have no way of defending yourself except maybe a state could raise a militia. So
yeah, that's right. And one of the things that when I was going to learning all this history, they talk about the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles of Confederation, I don't know if they gave them short shrift or if I just wasn't paying attention. I think either one is equally likely given my educational background, but it always felt to me like, okay, Articles of Confederation, blah, 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 Constitution, yay, here we are. And so I don't think I really grasped the significance of the type of thing the Articles of Confederation were, which is right there in the title, right? It's not a constitution, which comes from a Latin word meaning to set something up. And so it establishes an entity. These are articles. And so these are sort of guiding principles. And what are they principles for? Therefore, being bound together in a pact, confoidus, right? Confederatio. And so what they did was they described a general series of ideal relations, but among the states. And the relationship among the states was loose. It was the articles were the only formal statement of what obligations the states had relative to one another. And of course, the states were always free to simply not follow the articles if they wanted to. And there was no, I almost feel like to speak of a central government at that point is a bit of a misnomer. Really what you have is a delegation, like a United Nations, where the states are sort of coming together to try to agree to work together in certain sorts of ways.
The United Nations was exactly the analogy I was about to draw. Like it is a body that is technically above the national level, but it's like participation in it is so voluntary that it really lacks any enforcement mechanism. I mean, they can pass a climate change resolution where all the participants agree to cut emissions by a certain percentage, but there's really no penalty that can be doled out to the states that don't meet the goals, stated goals.
When they said that they declared Netanyahu or Putin war criminals and they call for their arrests. This is the World Court, and then nothing happens. It's really just more of a public move. There's no power behind it.
That's right. That's right. That's right. It's in some ways, I guess, descriptive rather than prescriptive. Like when the International Court says something like that, or the UN passes a resolution, it might describe how various states feel about a certain thing, but there's no way that it can actually solve the issue,
That's right.
unless you get perfect participation, which anybody who's ever worked in any sort of organization knows you'll just never get that. So
Yeah, that's right.
Now, the real problems with the Articles of Confederation came to a head in what was called Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787. And there's some debate among scholars, as far as I understand it anyways, as to whether or not this was really the crisis that it came to be described as. Some have argued that it was kind of taken by the more Federalist-leaning founding fathers and used as an impetus to push their agenda. But it was a very interesting flashpoint, and it does sort of reveal the fragility of the Union. You have a guy named Daniel Shay, who was the leader of a group of basically farmers, and most of whom were veterans of the War of Independence. And they lived in Western Massachusetts, and they were faced with really high taxation and crushing debts, and there was really no way for them to be supported. And so he raised basically a mob, and they ended up marching on Boston, or on Springfield, I think, and they closed the courts there. They attempted to seize a federal armory there, and no one could stop them, at least not at the federal level, because there was no real federal army to send in. And so the governor of Massachusetts basically commissioned a militia, and they used, I think, a commander from the American Army during the Revolutionary War. But that was what put them down. But it was a very narrow victory in terms of whether this rebellion was put down or not. And so a lot of the people who are involved in affairs of state looking on at that were like, we've got to fix this. And so that was kind of the test case that pushed the ball down the road. That eventually led to the Constitution, but it was really the thing that drove the writing of these Federalist Papers.
Yeah, and so fast forward a little bit, the Constitutional Convention happens, and then folks come together, and the founding fathers they produce a constitution, and this constitution has no force because they have no authority to impose this constitution on the states. And so it's sent around for all of the states to consider, and then they will either ratify it or not. If they ratify it, they become part of the United States of America. If they don't, theoretically, they remain their own independent entity. Maybe they become their own country or something like that, right? Yeah. And so that's the space of time where these papers fit in. The Constitution has been written and promulgated, and so people can read it, and states are trying to decide whether they're going to ratify it or not. And specifically, this collection of essays is concerned with that conversation in New York, where you had a large anti-Federalist party, Federalist referring to the coming together into the Constitution. You had a large anti-Federalist party that argued that New York would be better off on its own, not joining this new entity that was coming together. And so the Federalist Papers were a series of papers published in a newspaper that were arguing for the position that New York ought to ratify this. Obviously, spoiler alert, New York does ratify the Constitution and become one of the United States of America. Sorry if you didn't know that, but that is what happens. And historians do credit that to these documents. And these papers did a lot to move public opinion, not only in New York, but beyond New York as they became more widely known. And I think even after the Constitution had been adopted and the new Union was established, these Federalist Papers continue to do the work of helping people feel good about that decision and to really solidify that as something that people were willing to fight for and die for, which will become important at the Civil War, not even 100 years later, because that's it. That is sort of the resurgence of anti-federalism, right? Is that you say, actually, we have the right to take ourselves out of this. We voted ourselves in, we can vote ourselves out.
Yes, that's a very interesting, the legality of secession is a very interesting topic to research. It's out of our scope today, but there were a ton of arguments about that going on leading up to the Civil War. Absolutely. And we should say, in terms of the authorship of these, so they appeared, like you said, in a newspaper called the Independent Journal over the course of about maybe 8 months or so. And Alexander Hamilton wrote the bulk of them. He wrote 51 essays. James Madison wrote 29, and then John Jay wrote 5. And they wrote them under a pseudonym. Did you know this before? I
Yeah.
didn't really know this before. I had read these before, but I did not know about the pseudonym. The pseudonym was Publius, which refers to Publius Valerius Publicola, who was one of the founders of the Roman Republic. As you know, classics, that going that far, the Roman classics are not my specialty. So I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add about him and why they might have chosen him.
I don't have much. I think that the point you made is the big one, right? That it was the founding of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic was preceded by the tyranny. And after the Brudi, the Junius Brutus family, you're welcome, took down the last of the tyrants. And, tyrant wasn't a bad word. It was just an absolute ruler. But the last of the tyrants, Tarquin, was a bad dude. He was a tyrant in the modern sense of the word. And so there was this sense of, okay, we need something different. And the idea of a Roman Republic that Publius was a part of helping to found was so powerful, and it continued. And even in the imperial period of Rome, there was still a hearkening back to the republican principles of the Roman government. And so that's an intentional touch point to say, these were the golden years of Rome. They were set up by being a republic, and the empire was the beginning of the downfall. That's what we want to model ourselves after as Americans as well.
Yeah. And so as a result, you get a really interesting mix of things in these essays and really in the Constitution itself, right? I mean, on the one hand, there is this echo of classical republicanism that's found in the Romans, especially. You also get a lot of modern Enlightenment thought. So they're going to engage with Montesquieu a lot, who was a French Enlightenment philosopher who wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws in 1748. And he's the originator of the 3 branches of government idea. And Madison, I think, called Montesquieu the oracle, who was always consulted on matters of republican government and liberty. So you have that influence as well. But then you also have a kind of realism, I guess I would call it, in terms of human nature and that kind of thing. We'll talk about that in a minute. And so you have this kind of attempt to balance a number of really important values like liberty and order at the same time, which come through these pages. So perhaps we could talk about the first. Well, actually, it's really 9 and 10, Federalist Papers 9 and 10, because this kind of sets out one of the main problems facing a burgeoning state, like what America would have been at the time, and that is the problem of factions. Wherever there are people, there are factions, and factions are in some way, I mean, they're inevitable, obviously, but when they're allowed to become kind of the defining thing, or when one faction is allowed to manhandle another faction, then you can get a lot of instability, and that idea of liberty and order gets skewed.
That's right. And more importantly, well, as importantly, not more importantly, as importantly, factions threaten the democratic principle. Right, because then what factions do is they concentrate a lot of power around a common interest, and that if enough power gets concentrated around that interest, then that interest is actually able to silence, to shout down the majority voice. They're sort of a fake majority that can artificially take away the ability of the individual to actually have their voice be heard in the government process, right?
That's right. And I guess we should define it, because they actually go through great lengths to define what a faction is. A faction is a group that's united by interests that are against the public or common good. So, I mean, if you think about early America, I mean, you may have one colony that's primarily Anglican and another colony that's primarily Presbyterian. And so then when they send their representatives together, they, one comes with a different religious sort of agenda than the other. And so the principle here is to say, well, it's fine. I mean, of course, it's inevitable that we're going to have Anglicans and Presbyterians in our country, but how do we kind of limit their ability to ostracize the other and keep the other out of the political conversation. And so it would be bad for the common good if we just took all the Presbyterians and said, oh, well, we'll send them away. Well, maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing. I'm just kidding. I'm joking. But
he's an Anglican, guys. He's an Anglican.
That's right. That's right. But that would be one example. I mean, and of course, this could be something that would focus on, factions could focus on business interests.
Cotton.
Yeah, cotton, class, these kind of issues. So you have to be careful when you're setting these up that those factions, whatever factions they are, aren't allowed to sort of unduly take power in a way that is at the expense of the common good or the expense of everyone's voice being a part of this state.
Yeah, and Madison says something really nice about this in Federalist Paper number 10. When he's talking about factions, he says, if a faction consists of less than a majority, relief from the faction's potential evil is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. We can just vote them down, right? Hey, we want to convert all of our children into a workforce. No, vote it down. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. Now, here's the interesting part. When a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, a majority faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government in which the individual voice matters, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. So Madison makes this one of the foundational concerns of the founding of the Republic, is how do we ensure that a majority faction doesn't develop that is then able to use the power of being a majority to undercut the common interest of the states and the common good of the citizens. And that's what, they frame it not only a republic, but a large republic as the solution to this problem. And so the work that this identification does, he says, you can look at the causes of factions and you look at the remedies of factions. And he goes through the causes of factions and he says, we can't do anything about these. This is, like Father Wesley was saying, this is human nature, and it's going to keep happening. So since we can't deal with the causes, the only thing we can do is look at remedies. And he says the remedy is to make sure that we compass the factions in with a context that is so large that it will always render them ineffectual.
And that's a really important argument, because Montesquieu, from whom they're drawing quite a bit, actually believed that Republican governments had to be really small.
Right.
And so it was there. So one of the first things you have to do is say, no, this can work over a large expanse of population and geography, because we have those competing factions that can then kind of balance each other out. And so then one doesn't have the complete control of everything, which is why also direct democracy doesn't work. You need it to have a democratic republic for them, because that sets up certain barriers to one faction overdoing it. Right. So, I mean, it's why, you see this every 4 to 8 years, depending on how an election turns up. Right. So, one party might win the control of the House and the Senate and the presidency, but they're still checked in terms of what they can and can't do based on the courts and the legal process and stuff. So the courts will make sure that however the will is implemented, it's implemented in the right way and is constrained. And it has to be that way, or else, anytime a majority wins, you would kind of have a mob, really.
Yeah, and this point about Montesquieu is another great principle of what we're saying at the beginning, and of the classical method of reading and thinking, which is they're turning to Montesquieu as someone who is a major authority that can ground these arguments they're making, but at the same time, there are places where they have to disagree with him, and where a slavish attention to him would undercut their project and would serve the Anti-Federalist position. And so it's, tradition is always a negotiation with the past, and you're always having to choose how you're going to take up past writers and what parts you're going to emphasize, and if you're even going to throw some things out, right? I mean, you see this even in what people think of as the most monolithic and heavy-handed of traditions, the Catholic Church. If you track them through the ages, especially if you're looking at medieval Catholicism, there is a great deal of deftness and subtlety in how they take up things, and they are able to disagree with even the greatest of all authorities, St. Augustine. I keep a running list of every time I've seen in Bonaventure him explicitly disagree with St. Augustine about something.
Yes, my mind went exactly to Augustine when you started speaking. He was moderated by the tradition at the Council of Orange. And then you read medieval writers, and they won't, at least in my reading of most of them, they don't usually say Augustine is wrong, here's why. They will kind of sneak their disagreement into their commentary on what he's saying. So it's never quite so bold as to, explicitly disagree with him, but they'll tweak it.
Yeah.
And they'll use Augustinian language to kind of correct what they see as maybe an excess or something, and write the course a little bit more. And so you kind of see that here. I mean, it's there. This is the oracle, but they're still able to disagree with him.
That's right. And so this is one of the things that I thought was the most fascinating for me personally. The most fascinating question about the role of these arguments today was around this issue, because Madison would go on to say that the bigger government is better, and he gives a few reasons why. First, he says that the larger republic will present a greater option and consequently a greater probability of a fit choice of representatives. If you have a small republic, you only have so many people, you might not have as many good choices. In a large republic, you will. It says, in the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried, sophistry. And the suffrages of the people being more free will be more likely to center on men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. And then the really important one for me here is over at the end of the 2 paragraphs on. He says, extend the sphere, make it bigger, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. I think probably all of those, but absolutely the last one is no longer true because of mass media and especially because of social media.
Yeah.
Right. And so now all of a sudden size is no impediment to the majority discovering that they are a majority and discovering their power, because I can reach a theoretically unlimited number of people, right? I mean, this episode could go viral and 2 million people could listen to this conversation and it could shift American opinion in another direction. I'm not saying it's going to, but it's possible. To the extent that the type of men they describe who use these vicious arts to sway elections to their purpose, right? Now they have a platform where they can do that at a mass level. And all of a sudden, no size of government is too big for them to work on, because they can reach millions or billions with their message. And so it's interesting to me. And again, I'm not pushing any sort of agenda here or arguing for anything specific. I was just struck by the fact that the size of the republic, having all the states together in this big nation, was one of the central arguments for why this method of government would work. And seeing how something the founding fathers could never have anticipated in mass and social media really undercuts that argument. I'd be very fascinated to pull these guys in. But maybe we'll do that next month. We'll have Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay as special guests next month. And we'll see how they respond to, what would you do differently if you knew that this solution wasn't available to you?
Yeah, it seems like, so what their argument is here is that the larger the constituency, the higher caliber candidate you'll get, because they have to win over that many more people, which does make sense in their world. you're right. I think that mass media and social media both are really big barriers to that. And the reason is that they cause us to split two skills, right? So in the ancient, or not the ancient world, in the older world prior to mass media, you would have to give a speech to a crowd. And of course, in a speech, you can lie, you can make stuff up, but in general, you would have to be very specific. This is what I want to do. This is how I'm going to govern, etc. What has happened in the modern world is a bifurcation between campaigning and governing, right? So social media in particular incentivizes campaigning. And so even when somebody's governing, they're campaigning, right? It's about the next office. It's about climbing the ladder in some way. And so everything that they do is going to be all about advancing their particular either agenda or themselves up the ladder. But sometimes the best campaigners are not, in our modern sense, are not the best governors. In fact, I would argue rarely is that true. It's two separate skills, right? To actually think about things the way that Hamilton and Madison and Jay are doing here, to implement a vision of common flourishing and all that. That's a really heavy task. And so, I'll be honest, I was somewhat persuaded. I sometimes listen to Malcolm Gladwell's podcast called Revisionist History, and he did a whole episode on random elections. They found that in like schools, when you're electing a student government, for example, that just randomly drawing who is who's going to be president, who's going to be vice president, who's going to be the treasurer, etc., often yields better results than actual elections, because the actual elections are popularity contests. And so, the most popular kid gets elected president, but is he really going to be a good president? Maybe not. And so, anyway, so that is one of the big issues, is that you have a totally different emphasis on campaigning versus actually governing, I think.
Yeah, I once heard a stat, I can't recall what exactly was to mind, but the idea was that essentially, because of what it takes for a congressperson to get elected, they have to begin campaigning for their next term essentially as soon as they take office, or they'll be behind the ball. They won't have raised enough money. They won't have done enough to get the thing done, right? And so there's kind of this perpetual campaigning that has to go on in order to stay in your position, even while at the same time you're supposed to be governing. I think that's very true. And that's addressing the sort of first couple of the points of this. Is that third point, though, that sense of, what if I believe something really disgusting, like that women should be mistreated, or that African Americans are not fully human, or that Jews are evil, or something like that. I mean, truly despicable things. People think these things. This is no surprise. This is not news. Hopefully, our hope is that it's like a couple of isolated, misguided individuals whose power is largely limited by the fact that they're isolated, and they recognize that society at large would censure their opinions. But what if all of a sudden you had a way of getting your ideas out there and discovering, hang on a minute, I'm not alone. There's a lot of people who think this with me. In fact, there's millions of people who think this with me. All of us afraid in our own communities to speak up for similar reasons to what Madison was giving here, right? We're a minority, we're going to be censored, we don't want to. But all of a sudden, the anonymity of social media allows us to find each other, to express our views. And the connectedness of social media allows us to find one another. And now we can mobilize those views into political action, and we can actually perhaps become a movement that might be strong enough to seize control of the government and bend it against the good of the citizens, such as the citizens that we hate, for instance. Right. And that's something that I think Madison is right. You couldn't have done that on a national scale, even the smaller nation that he's dealing with here, at the time that they wrote these papers, but you absolutely can do that now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one wonders what the sequel would be to the Federalist Papers. So
that's right.
So we'll find out next month.
That's right. Yeah, guys, we're gonna have them raised. You can get a day pass from hell. They'll come up, and then we'll have a good conversation with them, and they'll get this all sorted out.
That's right. That's right. So the idea of faction is a problem. There are some solutions here: large republic, multiplicity of factions, no domination from one group, having sort of official channels that things have to go through. All this kind of points to the need for a union, right? Because the issue, of course, prior is that, whatever Massachusetts decides works for Massachusetts, but there's no national. So what Massachusetts could be interested in might be bad for what is good for New York. And so then you have kind of these interstate conflicts that could occur. So the Articles of Confederation, perhaps you would have had 50 different state or 50 different countries eventually, or maybe you would have a civil war much faster, I think, because those things would have accelerated because of those conflicts. There was no kind of way to mediate between the different sides.
That's right.
So we needed to have a union, and that really is, I think, the very first paper is kind of calling for that. And the stakes are whether human people can govern themselves by reflection and choice, which kind of plays into that last point a little bit. We're certainly testing the limits of that in some ways with social media, but the utility of union then plays a really important role in bringing those states together. There is a common interest, and so it's of more benefit to you to join into this buy into this bigger thing than if you just go it on your own.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so it becomes one of the things that I really liked about this, I'm looking at number 15 now, right? The insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union. And this is Hamilton. And he's saying in the third paragraph of this, some of the things you touched in the beginning, right? He's talking about, with the problem, there's scarcely anything that can wound the pride or degrade the character of an independent nation, which we do not experience, right? Are there engagements to the performance of which we are held by every tie respectable among men? These are the subjects of constant and unblushing violation. Do we owe debts to foreigners and to our own citizens, contracted in a time of imminent peril? These remain without any proper or satisfactory provision for their discharge. War bonds, right? You borrow money from the citizens to support a war. We can't pay you back. Your bonds are worthless. Have we valuable territories and important posts in the possession of a foreign power, which by express stipulations ought long since to have been surrendered? These are still retained to the prejudice of our own interests. And then my favorite one is, are we entitled by nature and compact to a free participation in the navigation of the Mississippi? Spain excludes us from it.
That's right. That's right. The Spaniards.
Yeah.
Another point he makes kind of in that section is that you can look around at the state of world affairs and see that this affiliation by treaty, which is really what you have in the Articles of Confederation, doesn't work.
Yeah,
a lot of the founding fathers, when you read them, like George Washington, for example, in his farewell speech, kind of urge Americans to stay away from European politics. And I don't know that it's isolationism per se in the way that a lot of people think it is. I think what they are saying is, if you look at the state of European politics, you see a lot of little fish fighting each other all the time. And so they may be temporarily aligned on a certain issue for a certain amount of time, but then they'll turn against each other at some point and they'll start fighting. And so, the history of Europe is all these kind of little confederations that, will get together and then break apart. And it just doesn't work. That chaos doesn't work. And so they want to learn lessons from history, and they want to avoid those problems.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a sense in which I'm hesitant to even say this. I want to say that England, the United Kingdom, I should say, is enjoying its longest period of peace in its history, which, you could date from like the end of World War II, except that's not quite true, because there was like the whole Falkland Islands thing. And, but in terms of England itself being under threat, I think World War II was the last time that was a significant thing. Never in the history of England have they gone this long without being at war with somebody. And I think you could say that for pretty much every other European nation that has managed to not be at war since World War II, which a lot of them have not been. Ukraine's at war right now, for instance. As a student of medieval European history, among other things, it's, the story is one of constantly these factions form and they turn against each other, whether it be political powers within a nation, or whether it be small duchies to come together to make a larger kingdom, and then the kingdom fractures and breaks apart. But there's this constant sense of the treaties don't work. They're just temporary measures. Every treaty is essentially an armistice, and there's going to be a resumption of hostilities at some point. That's the lesson of history, and it's very clear at the time that the founding fathers are writing it. This really hasn't changed at all, and it won't change for 150 years after they write this. Right, if we consider it to have changed now. So it's a really powerful point to make, that if you want to depend on the goodwill of the person who's bound themselves to you by a treaty, that's a real shaky bridge to build your security on.
I've been reading The Institutions by Cassiodorus recently, and he's got a whole thing at the very beginning where he's like, I really wanted to found a school where all these Christians could go to learn how to read the scriptures well, but I can't because there's war in Italy.
Yeah. That's right.
So that's what they were facing. And so, yeah, to avoid that, we needed a more Republican style government that incorporates the states rather than allowing them to be kind of free agents who voluntarily align with each other from time to time.
Yeah. And in testament to the brilliance of their solution, right? The last time war significantly raged on our shores, we were fighting ourselves.
Right. Over a lot of these questions.
That's right. And so there's a sense in which the size of the republic meant that we wound up pushing all of our enemies out. Yep. And so we didn't have any major threats over here. But also it did mean that, the Civil War, which was testing exactly this question, was the last time we had a major conflict of, and listen, guys, war, as I'm not downplaying how bad Americans' experience of World War I and World War II were, but war where your armies are fighting in terrible, awful conditions over there are a whole different animal than war where your non-combatant citizens are subjected to the violence of armies. That's a whole different thing.
Well, and we can think about like the war between the Greeks and the Persians, like in 300. I mean, one of the reasons why that was such a hard thing for the Greeks was because they were all these city-states had to come together and decide that they were going to fight the Persians. And of course, then you get certain states that might say, well, maybe we'll capitulate to the Persians and we'll get a better deal out of it because we were the first ones to go. And so there's no real way to respond to the threat within that context. If one of those groups folds, then the whole thing could be doomed. And so if you're, one of the groups that doesn't want to fold, then you're really in trouble when it gets to you. And so there has to be some sort of central decision making that occurs.
Wow, that's really great. It really underscores that this question is as old as the Western tradition, because it's there in the Iliad. Right? I mean, there is no Greece in the Iliad. There's all these different nations that are kingdoms. They're all kings that are coming together to fight together. And when Achilles pulls out and decides and pulls his army out and sits on the shore, that's exactly what we're talking about. What if we're fighting a war and Texas doesn't want to go? All of a sudden we're missing hundreds of thousands of troops and all those resources and things like that. That's the type of thing that's at stake. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, and of course, everybody listening to this will be so excited to about this, is that one of the central powers that the state has to have is the ability to tax people. Yeah.
Because if they can't, then they can't do basic functions that you would expect a nation to be able to do, like defend itself or other public services and works. And so that's, I think, in 30 is where Hamilton argues for the ability of the state to tax, because relying solely on state quotas just can't work. First of all, you have to opt in, and then second, that state has to actually raise the money, which there's no guarantee that they'll actually be able to do. That funding could get subverted or whatever. There's a whole host of things that can go wrong, and so the federal authority really has to have the ability to levy taxes on the people. Yeah,
that's right. And you may not like it, and you may not like what they do with it, and that's one of the reasons why you're left a voice in government, is so that you aren't impotent in the face of not liking what they do with it. But the number of things that we would not have if we didn't have taxes, I mean, the country wouldn't exist. No country could last because we'd be conquered at the very least. But, you know, I enjoy public utilities.
Right.
These things are paid for by taxes. They aren't all paid for by state taxes. There's federal money coming down to provide for the consistency of my utilities, these types of things. And so it's a contentious issue, right? It was the spark that lit the fuse of the American Revolution in the first place, was taxation. And so it's really gutsy to talk about that and to elevate that as a major important issue. But it absolutely is. It's just part and parcel of many medieval kings lost their thrones because they got involved in wars they couldn't keep up the payments for, and they began taxing the citizens more heavily in order to pay for it, and they wound up getting a revolt.
And the nice thing about a more democratic style of governance is that you can more easily walk the line, I think, between the dangers of overtaxation and undertaxation, right? So the undertaxation would be the state's not bringing in enough money to pay for what it needs to do. So then you have the problem of the European kings, right? They're not able to fund their wars or whatever else they're doing. But if you're overtaxing the people, then, you know, life really becomes impossible. Flourishing is very difficult. And so, you know, what do you do then? And there are also plenty of stories about bad kings who would tax people to the nth degree. And they end up usually, you know, a revolt or some form of rebellion ends up happening, the mob, you know, and if you're
Robin Hood.
That's right, Robin Hood, that's right. And so, so having the people have an input in who is governing and what policies they want can help avoid that, to where, yeah, we do need some services. It's good that we have roads and interstates and stuff like that. But if we feel like we're getting too taxed, then we can also push back against that as well.
Right. That's right. It may be worth, maybe we should switch now to talking about the branches.
Yes, absolutely.
And the other great, you know, solution of the constitutional framers, which is the balance of power.
That's right. That's right. So there are the three branches of government, which of course everybody learns in civics class in 5th grade or whatever, but the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. But what's interesting and what you may wonder is, why is there two legislative bodies? There is, of course, the Senate, and then there's the House of Representatives. So why is it that we split those two into two houses? The bicameral legislation is how they define it. And that's a very interesting discussion. I think this is in 62 and 63 of the Federalist Papers, but effectively, they have different compositions. So the Senate is very egalitarian. Every state gets two. California has just as many senators as Rhode Island does. But the House of Representatives is more direct. Oh, and the term limits are different too, right? Because you get 6 years in the Senate. So your senators serve for longer. But in the House of Representatives, they have shorter terms and they're more local, right? So rather than the whole state of Maryland, I have a representative that represents my voting district. And so there's more access, there's more voice there. And it allows for the diversity within that state a little bit more to be represented at a federal level than just if you just are sending two people. And so it's a really genius split to have those two houses kind of who have to work together. But you know, the priority of one might be a little different than the other, or you know, the one house might not pass a legislation that the other house approves, and so they have to kind of work together to compromise a little bit. So it's that other layer that allows that conversation to happen rather than, you know, one house just sort of pushing something through in the dead of night or whatever, or without much input.
So then, let me know if you can answer this question on behalf of the authors of the Federalist Papers. Is it possible to give a succinct account for what is the logic of assigning certain specific tasks to the body that represents everyone equally, with equal amounts of representation, and others to the body that represents the more local? Can we sort of distill a principle that says, oh, this is clearly ought to go to the Senate and this ought to go to the House?
Yeah, I think that there's a few reasonings kind of undergirding the distinction there. So, I mean, one big thing, for example, would be impeachment, right? So we've seen a couple of those in our lifetimes, I suppose, with Clinton and Trump both being impeached. And if you're an older listener, maybe you were alive during Nixon and that impeachment. But it's the House that gets to basically accuse, right? And so they raise the issue, but then it's the Senate that actually does the trial and confirm and moves based on whatever happens in that trial. And so I think that, again, you have another layer of accountability. It's the representatives who are more local, who are specific, who don't serve as long, who have to raise the issue. But then those who are in Congress for a longer time get to sort of hash it all out. And I think there's some wisdom in that. It would make sense to have the two bodies kind of operating as two arms in that process. And it creates accountability, right? And it also prevents instability. So if you have Congress, if you have representatives who are both calling and conducting the investigation into the impeachment and the trial, you almost get the idea that there would be an incentive to do it more often. Whereas the senators who are there for a longer period of time, like, there's a little bit more steadiness, I suppose. Let's see. I guess, and then of course the other would be that the House of Representatives has the power of the purse, and the Senate does not, which is a power that makes sense to me. It's almost the inverse of impeachment, right? In impeachment, the House calls it, the Senate does it. In the budget, the House gets to come up with it, and the Senate has to sort of confirm it. And so you have that dynamic at play as well. Also,
I would recommend. Okay.
The only other thing I was going to say is that it's the Senate that confirms presidential nominations, right? Not the House.
Yeah.
And so again, there's that kind of the idea that the Senate is a little bit above or elevated, right? They have a little bit of a higher view of things. They're working closely with the president in terms of making sure his people are qualified in order to do the job that they're called to do and stuff. They're accountable for that, whereas representatives are not.
Yeah. So it's very different than English Parliament, where you have a House of Lords and a House of Commons. And so the House of Lords is, every noble sort of sits on it, right?
I misspoke too. House of Representatives only serve every 2 years.
That's right. Yeah, House is 2, Senate is 6.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I said 4, but I think that was that's not correct. It's 2 years.
And so these, there was this sense of, okay, the House of Lords is the original Parliament. Those were the barons who gathered around the Jarl and the Anglo-Saxon times and whatnot. And then there was a sense of, okay, now we're going to make a space for the voice of the people. So we have the House of Commons, and they can kind of come in. And so you get these two different social classes represented by the House of Lords and the House of Commons. That's not the way ours is. And it's not an imitation of that parliamentary system. There's this sense, and it's becoming clearer to me as we're talking here, I think, than it's ever been before, because I'm not great at government. There's this sense that there are certain issues that all states have a right to have an equal voice in. And those things go to the Senate, where every state has an equal voice. And so California is not more powerful than Rhode Island in the Senate, even though California is maybe one of the biggest states and Rhode Island is the smallest. But then there's other matters where it's not about the states having equal voice. It's about trying to represent the nuances of the different compositions of the peoples within the states. And that's when it makes sense that you have those things shift to the House, because then you've got people who say, well, even though my fellow senator from my state, my fellow representative from my state would want to would argue that we need to be doing this. For the people of my district, the concern is this. And so we can't accept a solution that doesn't address our concern. And then that forces us to work together, even within the state, to find a solution that fits everybody everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And so it divides issues out, not into, this is still not federal versus states' rights stuff, because you're still going to have your separate state legislatures that are going to handle proper state business. It's rather the issues that belong to the federal government that to which it is right that states have different levels of voice in, right?
That's right.
And things like impeaching the president, declaring war, making treaties, every state should have an equal say in that. But and things like how the money's being spent, it maybe California should have a bigger say in that than Rhode Island, because they're going to be much more materially affected, and much more particularly affected, right? Northern California and Southern California are not going to have the same sets of interests in how the money's being spent.
And a state like California puts more money in because they have more people. So more people there are paying income tax. And so Rhode Island, as great as they are, they just don't have as many people. And so they're not providing as many resources. And so their say is muted compared to California's. Not that they don't have one, but it's proportional, which makes
it's a good time for us to say to the good people of Rhode Island that we value you and we're glad you're part of the union.
We see you.
That's right.
For all 30 minutes of driving through your state, we see you. So that's the legislative branch. And it's important to have that balance. I think in 63, it says sometimes the people themselves are the problem. So it's important that we have that layer between the people and the actual laws themselves, right? Of course, the Congress exists to implement the will of the people, at least in a perfect world, but they have to do that in a way that balances a whole host of considerations and that works together and all that. So that's a good way to divvy it up. Now, the next branch is the executive branch, the presidency. And it's here that the kind of what has become a controversial issue is raised in paper 68, which is the Electoral College. And I think, at least in theory, the idea is this. In a world where the popular vote decides the election, you are more exposed to demagoguery. For the same, so it leaves you vulnerable in many of the same ways that just a direct democracy would leave you open. Having the Electoral College, because what people don't understand, first of all, it's proportional, right? So the amount of people who live in a certain state weights their vote differently, just like their representatives in Congress are determined by how many people live there. But also what you're voting for is you're voting for electors who will vote a certain way. And so there is, again, another filter in the system, right? So if an elector feels like something illegal has happened or there's some sort of crisis, they can then vote in a particular way. Now, a lot of states have rules about what electors can and can't do. So it's not, and it's very rare that you have an untethered elector who goes to an, who does the opposite of what how the state voted. But they are there as kind of a guardian of the election. And so that part makes some sense to me anyways, that we would want to protect the process by providing another kind of layer in between the people and the actual office itself.
Yeah, I think that one conversation that it would be possible to have, and we don't really need to have it here, but one conversation this does bring up, I mean, what Hamilton says is, this is the happily combined advantages is this: the people of each state shall choose a number of persons as electors equal to the number of senators and representatives, who shall assemble within the state and vote for some fit person as president, and then their votes are given. So the image Hamilton seems to have is that we will vote not for presidents or candidates, but for electors. And the electors will gather together and they will vote for president. And then those votes will be gathered and tabulated. What actually happens is the electors are sort of lined up according to various candidates. And when you vote for the candidate, you're really voting for the electors that selected that candidate. And then that gets, on top of that, you get the winner take all policy that most states have, where whoever gets the majority of the votes, all the electoral votes just go to that one. And so in a sense, the electors aren't really electing. they turn more into almost a hypothetical way of allocating this state's weight for a candidate or not. And I think that's something that, again, when we have this, when we launch the new podcast, which is going to be Classical Mind from Beyond the Grave, and it's going to be great, guys, because we'll just talk to all these guys directly and just kind of see, what their take is on things. That would be another issue I'd be really interested to get the three writers of the Federalist Papers take on, is how do they feel the current way of implementing the Electoral College lines up with their expectations. I could very easily imagine someone like Hamilton saying, yeah, no, that's cool. Like, what you're doing is great. And like, it fits what I was saying for these reasons. But I could equally well imagine him saying, that is not what I was talking about. And I feel like you've kind of made the Electoral College moot. You kind of made them empty. I don't know Hamilton well enough. I haven't read enough of his stuff to have a sense for where he would come down on it. But it would certainly be an interesting conversation.
Yeah. There have been a couple instances in which electors have had to play a more expansive role. So, for example, in 1872, Ulysses S. Grant won against Horace Greeley, and really it was a joint ticket. It was like a Democrat/Progressive Republican ticket, which is interesting. But I think, if I remember correctly, Greeley died before the election, before the electors had gathered. And so the electors then had to decide, well, what do we do? The ones who are pledged to him, what do we do? And so they would obviously have to make their own decision. And I think this happened again with, in I think 1912, with Woodrow Wilson versus Roosevelt and Taft. So anyway, so it does happen sometimes where electors will have some impact before that's different than how that's voted, but it is rare.
Yeah, and it's interesting that so I was just looking at this. There are 29 states plus DC that have laws that require electors to cast their votes according to the popular vote.
Yeah,
which means that there are 21 states that do not have such a law, and so the electors would be free to cast their votes differently, right?
And then isn't it Maine and Nebraska that have the rules that they vote that the district sort of gets its own elector, so
that's
they
right.
split. Yeah,
they don't do the winner take all. They're the only two who don't do winner take all. And so apparently in the 2016 election, there were what were called the 7 faithless electors who voted for differently than the way the popular vote said they should go, but within their legal rights. And so 3 of them cast votes for Colin Powell, who wasn't even a candidate in the race.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so there are some instances that of electors acting against popular votes, and there are several, not a majority, but nearly as many states as not allow the electors to choose differently than what the popular vote says, but in practice they don't.
So I did look this up while we were talking about this. So one of the DC electors who was supposed to vote for Al Gore and Joe Lieberman in 2000 didn't cast a vote at all because she was protesting DC's lack of congressional representation. So I thought that was interesting. And then in 2004, one of the Minnesota electors who was pledged for John Kerry and John Edwards did not count because he wrote down E words instead of Edwards.
Come on. You know what he meant.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Autocorrect.
That is a funny DC, of course, is always interesting with this stuff because DC citizens are taxed and they don't have a representative, and so the DC license plates famously say taxation without representation. Yeah, there is this sort of sense of why do they get an elector if they don't have a representative when the electors equal the number of representatives? Well, because otherwise DC people don't get to vote for president. Right. It's right. This weird status DC has as not a state, and all these other sorts of things. It's fascinating.
It is very interesting. So the final branch of government is the judiciary. And the judiciary is, well, I guess in 78, he calls it at one point the least dangerous branch. It doesn't have control of the sword. It doesn't have control of the purse. Can't declare war, can't tax you or anything like that. And it's really important in the way that Hamilton describes the judiciary that it is independent from politics. So there is, to implement the will of the people, a need for that kind of flexibility. Term limits come up, they expire. You got to go on to the next guy. You got to make sure your seat is, you have your elections every so often to make sure that you're the person that people want. But judges really don't operate that way. I mean, we do sometimes elect judges, maybe in our local elections and things like that. But even then, they're really not as ideologically driven, or they shouldn't be as ideologically driven as the other kinds of branches are, because their job is more procedural. Are we following the laws of the Constitution and the laws of our country? That's their job. And so they're there to make sure that everything is observed. They're kind of the safeguards against abuse of the process. Like we have already talked about a few instances in which that authority that could be abused. And so the judiciary is there to say, nope, you can't do that. And we've seen that, right? I mean, and it's not just our current administration. I mean, if you look back, I think all the way back to the George W. Bush era in particular, there are tons of challenges about whether the president can or can't do certain things because the executive branch has been expanding for a long time. So they end up inevitably bumping into the edge of where their authority is constitutionally. And so then the courts have to hash out, well, is it allowed for us to do this and not that? Or can you do this? And so that is a really important function, one that maybe is not as appreciated because they're not as public, right? To go on the Supreme Court is not about campaigning. Right? You're selected and you have to go through pretty intense scrutiny in order to get there. Those are the top legal scholars, in the world, really. And so it's really important that they're not open to the whims of the larger culture in the way that some of the other offices are.
It's interesting, though, because the Supreme Court, at least, those judges are appointed by the sitting president. They have to have played a certain amount of politics to be eligible, right, to be pickable when the time comes. But then once they're appointed, they have a lifetime appointment, and there's no real recourse for a president for someone who departs from what the president's reason for picking them was, right? Once they get there, they're free to act as their conscience dictates. And that's an interesting question because, with elected officials, we talk about their obligation to the people that elected them because they were elected to pursue certain policies. And if they're not doing that, we can talk about a breach of faith with those who elected them. With the judges, they're appointed, but that appointment doesn't, in the minds of most people, carry a similar duty to abide by the whims and wills of the person who appointed them, right? And once you get there, use your own best judgment. And that's an interesting thing. I do think that the power of judiciary has become incredibly important in recent terms, as you say, going back to at least George H.W., where you have the expansion of the use of the executive order, right? And which is essentially the president acting unilaterally. That's what an executive order does. The president has powers, certain unilateral powers. And so executive orders are not bad things. But as the presidents have decided to make more and more use of the executive order in order to get their agendas done, the judiciary is the natural, this is all artificial, but the originally intended mechanism for ensuring that the president is not overstepping and that the nature of the government isn't subtly and slowly shifting and changing into something else, right? And that's what's concerning whenever any president brings political pressure to bear on the judiciary. That's the same thing as, that's like the corruption that we see in TV shows where you'll have mayors who are, pressuring police commissioners to do what they want to do and things like this. That's something that should always be concerning, whatever the politics of the president, right? the judiciary's got a job to do, and its job is to watchdog the other branches.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So they're not always going to be popular in a world where if most people, or even just a loud group of people, want a certain agenda implemented and the courts stop that agenda from being implemented on procedural grounds, they will be a kind of lightning rod. They're kind of like the offensive line, you know, you don't really hear from them unless things are going wrong. And so, you know, when things are going great, nobody really knows or cares too much about the Supreme Court. But when they're in the news a lot, it's because they're, you know, making decisions that are going to inevitably be unpopular to a large number of people.
That's right.
So
I wouldn't have gotten that far if there weren't a lot of people who wanted to see it go a certain way, right?
That's right. That's right.
That's right. Well, and this is what's so cool about the injunction, right? Because an injunction is not a I'm unilaterally declaring that you're wrong. An injunction is, hold on a second. There could be a deeper legal issue here. We need to slow down. We need time to go over this properly and make sure that we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. I think a lot of times, because of the politics of it, the injunctions get represented as judges sort of unilaterally stepping in front of the policies of Congress or of the president or whatever else. But really it's saying, no, hang on. We need to get involved here. We got to do our process, and we just need time to get our process done.
Yeah. Yeah. And the emphasis, of course, too, is usually not so much on the substance of the thing, but on the procedure of it. Are you doing this the right way?
Yeah.
And that's really important, because if they're not watching to make sure that that's done, then we're in a lot of danger. It's the same thing as like being a defense lawyer, right? Defense lawyers get a bad reputation because they have to defend all sorts of people, but those people need to have someone defending them.
Yeah.
Even if that person is so guilty that it's not even close, they have to have a defense lawyer who's helping them kind of figure out what the best step is in their particular context. And so, you know, it may not be that the policy itself is bad or that it's coming from a bad place, but hey, are we doing this the right way? And so sometimes that makes you a stick in the mud, you know, but at the same time, it's really important for any organization to make sure that they dot their I's and cross their T's, especially one that's dealing with these issues like freedom and liberty and order and all those kind of things. So right. It's a really important job.
In many ways, the jokes that we all make jokes about lawyers, and how ridiculous they are, how much they're sticks in the mud, and all these other sorts of things. But when you need a lawyer, you want a lawyer.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's exactly it. So yeah, so it's really cool to see, I think, in reading this, just how when these three branches are working harmoniously, how it is a great system. I think we get a lot of flack, and some of it rightfully so, in terms of the current state of things. But it is a really genius system, and it's one that these works have helped me appreciate a whole lot more.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I definitely understand and appreciate our system more. You know, you mentioned at the beginning reading these in high school, I think you said. Yeah. I've never read these before. This is my first time. Yeah, because I just
chalk it up. Oh, the scoreboard. It goes up. My count goes up. I think this is maybe the second time that you have.
This season, you're really kind of you're knocking me down this season. Because you've really had my number. And it really has given me a greater understanding of some of the rationale behind some of this stuff, and an appreciation for some of the choices that were made. And you know, like I said, I have questions about, I think some of these things need to be revisited in light of changes in technology and in culture of the last 250 years. I mean, come on, it's been 250 years. Like, we need to make sure we're revisiting this stuff and looking at whether there need to be some major rethinking. And I think I will go ahead and say it. I'll put it out there. I am calling for a symposium on the Federalist Papers, a referendum, if you will, to address the question of the adequacy of the government set up by the Federalist, defended by the Federalist Papers, set up by the Constitution, to achieve the ends it was trying to achieve in the context of the major changes that have taken place in technology and society over the last 3 centuries. I think we need a comprehensive reexamination of, not for the purpose of looking for something to change to, but for the purpose of really articulating incredibly well how the situation has changed, because it's a really different situation now.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be part of that referendum. I'm not
You're
inviting
just calling
myself
for
to it. I won't submit a paper to the call for papers, but somebody needs to sit down and have this conversation who's got a lot more experience, and who, for whom this is not the first time reading it, who's been reading it and living and breathing it inside and out. And my hope is, I'm just ignorant, right? Probably this is what political scientists and political theorists and whatnot do all the time, is have these conversations, and probably the governmental officials are listening to them. But just in case that's not happening, let's get on it, guys.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One other kind of takeaway for me is that coming from a Christian perspective, but I think this is true of a kind of general humanism. I mean, certainly it comes from Christianity and all that, but I think if you're not a religious person, what I'm about to say shouldn't necessarily alienate you, which is that looking at our current system and the way that we have input, and the way that there are these different modes and channels for engagement with the political, it becomes a really good place for us to exercise care for neighbor. And so insisting, for example, on the dignity of all people, regardless of my political affinity for them, can become a real exercise that we actually engage in, rather than displacing that ethical responsibility onto a king or, whatever, an autocrat or something like that. We actually do get to play an active role. And I think I can appreciate that a great deal. I think that's really cool that we get that input.
Yeah, that's great.
My only suggestion would be that we do ranked choice voting instead of our current system. I think that would input more nuance into our decision, but that's just me. Nobody asked, but there's my one tweak. My one sequel to the Federalist Papers would be on the need for ranked choice voting. So very good. Well, I think we have been talking for quite a while, so it's probably a good idea for us to start to land the plane and maybe talk about our endnotes. Junius, what's your endnote?
Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna have to reach a little bit to pull this off, listeners. So stay with me here. I'm gonna pick The Closing of the American Mind, which is a book by Alan Bloom. Now, this book is largely about higher education in the United States, and his argument is that the embracing of moral relativism by universities has actually undermined critical thinking and a pursuit of truth. This was written in the late 80s, like 1987, I think. And the reason that I'm going to say that I'm saying that is because, this issue that I've kind of identified as a thing that disturbs me most after reading the Federalist Papers, of how do we mitigate factionalism and the seizure of power by private interests and turning it against the freedom and rights of the citizens at large. I think a lot of that starts at education and the level of education, how we're treating truth, how we're talking about these issues, how we're even learning and laying the groundwork for decent civil discourse, right? And so I think The Closing of the American Mind is an excellent way to kind of bridge from the Federalist Papers to some of this thing I'm talking about, okay, how are we going to kind of course correct for ways in which technology has added new challenges to what Hamilton et al. Are calling for.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to take two. The first is, of course, Hamilton, the musical. If you've not seen it or listened to it, I feel like you have to after talking about Alexander Hamilton.
Wait, what? They made a musical about Hamilton?
Yeah, they did. For those of us who don't live under rocks, they did. But anyways, it's good. I mean, it's at this point it's a bit overplayed, perhaps, but it's still not a bad way to engage with some of these things in a relevant and modern way. But the other kind of more serious one that I was going to say is Democracy in America by de Tocqueville, which I think is a really interesting pairing with this, because, right, the Federalist Papers is kind of looking forward, what do we want to be, and Democracy in America is kind of looking at, okay, what has happened, what is this thing? So it's 50 years into the experiment, and he emphasizes a lot of the same kind of themes that we've looked at, liberty, equality, virtue, tyranny, institutions, that kind of stuff. But it's cool because he's French, and so it's a foreign mirror. That's the first time I've ever said that, by the way. It's cool because he's French. In terms of him being an outsider, so he's giving his perspective on what is going on here, and so we get to kind of see our blind spots nationally, anyways, in some of his comments, and so I think that's cool. And of course, there's a lot of good engagement with classics throughout Democracy in America. I mean, he's got Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and some of the Christian thinkers and Enlightenment thinkers kind of in mind as he's writing, and so all that is really good. And then I think looking forward for us, it's a helpful book because it kind of asks us, where are our virtues and where do they stand now, and how do we want to keep them, and what do we want those things to look like as we enter into the future.
Yeah, good.
So, yeah, there we have it. They say it's a bad dinner guest who talks about theology and politics, and I feel like we did both of those things today, and we often do. So maybe we're not people you want to invite over for dinner.
But we are delightful, so like there's that.
There is that. I feel like if you're listening to this podcast, you probably don't have too much of a problem with people who talk about theology and politics too much. So,
well,
anyway.
We can make amends. Here's what we're going to do to make it up to you. Next month, we are going to talk about Peter Pan.
That's exactly right. We are. And we're going to do the novel, not the play, because it was a play first, right?
Yes. And then the novel came a while later, and a lot of the differences are the novel expands on a lot of the characters and a lot of the backstory and things like that. And that's a lot of that is the form that became the ground for later versions of the story. So we'll be looking at the novel, still by J.M. Barrie, Peter Pan.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to that.
Me too.
All right, listeners. Well, thanks for joining us. And in the meantime, keep reading.